Hey everyone, and welcome back to another cozy evening of Minecraft and mayhem. While I'm expanding my base here, we're diving into a story that'll make your blood boil and then leave you oddly satisfied. Imagine that someone you trust completely, someone with access to your most private moments, decides that betraying you is their ticket to success. They thought they were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but they forgot one crucial detail. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been watching and leaving feedback in the comments. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and let me know you're enjoying this kind of content. I read every single one of them. I'll keep doing my best to help you relax and unwind as we explore some of the wildest Reddit drama on the internet. Tonight's story starts in a tech startup where ambition and betrayal collide in the messiest way possible, and trust me, the fallout is absolutely nuclear. I thought I had it all figured out at 29. My tech startup was finally taking off after 3 grueling years of 18-hour days and ramen dinners. We'd just closed our Series A funding, and I was riding high on that CEO adrenaline that makes you feel invincible. The only dark cloud in my otherwise perfect sky was my divorce from my college sweetheart, which was turning messier by the week. That's when Sarah came into my life like some kind of corporate guardian angel. Sarah had this incredible resume, 5 years at Google, an MBA from Northwestern, and references that practically sang her praises. But what really sold me was how she handled the interview. While other candidates were pitching themselves like they were auditioning for American Idol, Sarah just calmly laid out exactly how she'd organize my chaos. She talked about creating systems for everything, from investor communications to my personal calendar. And honestly, I was desperate for someone to take control of the administrative nightmare my life had become. The first few months with Sarah were absolute bliss. She anticipated my needs before I even knew I had them. Coffee appeared on my desk exactly when my energy started flagging. She'd already drafted responses to emails I hadn't even read yet. When my divorce lawyer needed documents, Sarah had them organized and ready to go. She even started managing my personal stuff, paying bills, scheduling maintenance for my condo, booking my therapy appointments. I gave her access to everything because, frankly, I trusted her more than I trusted myself to keep my life together. Looking back, I should have noticed how Sarah always seemed to know exactly what to say during my lowest moments. When my ex-husband's lawyer was being particularly vindictive, she'd bring me tea and remind me that I was building something bigger than his petty revenge. When I'd have panic attacks about the company's burn rate, she'd show me charts proving we were actually ahead of projections. She was like having a personal cheerleader who also happened to be incredibly competent at her job. The thing about Sarah was how she made herself indispensable so gradually that I didn't realize it was happening. First, she asked for my email password so she could filter out the noise and only show me important messages. Then she needed access to my cloud storage to organize investor documents. Soon she was answering my phone, scheduling my meetings, and even handling some of my social media accounts. I was so buried in product development and fundraising that I barely registered how much control I was handing over. My divorce was getting uglier by the week, and Sarah became my emotional support system. She'd stay late to listen to me vent about my ex's latest legal maneuver, or his attempts to claim he deserved equity in my company because he'd supported me through the early days. Sarah would nod sympathetically and remind me that I'd built this company with my own hands, my own vision, my own sacrifice. She'd even bring wine sometimes, and we'd sit in my office complaining about men who couldn't handle successful women. But that wasn't even the worst part. Sarah started documenting everything. At first, I thought she was just being thorough, keeping detailed notes about meetings and decisions. She'd send me recaps of conversations I'd had with investors, complete with her observations about how I'd performed. Sometimes she'd gently suggest that I'd seem tired or stressed during important calls, and maybe I should consider delegating more responsibilities to her. The red flags were all there, but I was too overwhelmed to see them. Sarah would occasionally mention that board members had asked her questions about my well-being. She'd frame it as them being concerned about the pressure I was under, but looking back, I realized she was the one feeding them information. She'd casually mention that I'd had to reschedule meetings due to therapy appointments, or that I'd seemed emotional during investor calls. She positioned it as her being protective of me, but she was actually building a case against my leadership. The morning everything fell apart started like any other. We had a crucial investor meeting scheduled for 10 a.m., with potential Series B funders. This wasn't just any pitch, this was the meeting that would determine whether we could scale fast enough to beat our competitors to market. I'd been preparing for weeks, running through scenarios with Sarah, who'd helped me anticipate every possible question. I walked into that conference room feeling confident, wearing my lucky blazer and carrying the presentations Sarah had helped me perfect. The investors were already seated, checking their phones and making small talk. These weren't just any investors either. We're talking about partners from Tier 1 venture capital firms, people who could write 8-figure checks without blinking. The kind of meeting that could change everything. That's when my phone started buzzing. Not just once or twice, but continuously, like someone was calling and hanging up and calling again. I tried to ignore it, but then I noticed the investors were also getting notifications. One by one, their faces changed from polite interest to horror. The woman from Benchmark looked like she'd seen a ghost. The partner from Sequoia actually stood up and walked toward the window, phone pressed to his ear. Then came the breaking point. My phone finally stopped buzzing long enough for me to check it, and my blood turned to ice. Dozens of text messages, missed calls, and notifications from every social media platform I had. The first text I opened was from my CMO, and it just said, "What the hell is going on?" followed by a string of crying emojis. I excused myself from the meeting, which was basically over anyway, since all the investors were now huddled in corners, having urgent phone conversations. In the hallway, I finally opened my email and saw the nightmare that had been unleashed on my professional life. Someone had sent intimate photos of me, photos I'd taken for my ex-husband during happier times in our marriage, to our entire company directory. But not just the company, they'd also sent them to our investor mailing list, our board members, and apparently half the tech industry in San Francisco. The email that accompanied the photos was even worse than the images themselves. It was written as if it came from a concerned employee, warning that I was having a mental breakdown and was unfit to lead the company. It detailed my therapy appointments, my divorce drama, and even mentioned specific conversations I'd had about my anxiety medication. The email suggested that the board should consider interim leadership while I got the help I clearly needed. You almost have to admire the audacity. This wasn't just revenge porn. This was corporate assassination with surgical precision. Whoever did this knew exactly which investors would be most concerned about leadership stability, which board members were already nervous about my age and experience, and which employees might be ambitious enough to capitalize on the chaos. As I'm standing in that hallway, watching my professional reputation get incinerated in real time, Sarah appeared at my elbow with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression that now seems absolutely psychotic. She asked if I was okay, if there was anything she could do to help, and suggested that maybe I should go home for the day while she handled the immediate crisis. She even offered to draft a company-wide email explaining that I was the victim of a malicious attack. I spent the next 72 hours in complete damage control mode, but the harm was already done. 3 investors pulled out of the Series B discussion before the day was over. 2 board members called emergency meetings to discuss my fitness for leadership. Half my engineering team sent carefully worded emails asking if they should be updating their LinkedIn profiles. My divorce lawyer called to warn me that my ex-husband's team was definitely going to use this against me in court. But that wasn't even the worst part. While I was frantically trying to save my company and my reputation, Sarah was positioning herself as the stable, responsible alternative. She was the one fielding calls from investors, the one organizing crisis management meetings, the one presenting herself as the calm voice of reason in the middle of my very public meltdown. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. I hired a cybersecurity firm to trace the source of the leak, thinking maybe my ex-husband had hacked my accounts or paid someone to sabotage me. I was prepared for a lot of possibilities, but I wasn't prepared for the truth. The photos had been accessed from my personal cloud account using my own login credentials. From my office IP address at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, when only Sarah and I had after-hours access to the building. The security firm's report was devastating in its clarity. Someone with intimate knowledge of my schedule, my passwords, and my personal relationships had been planning this attack for months. They'd accessed my accounts dozens of times, downloaded not just the photos, but also personal documents, therapy notes, and private communications with my divorce lawyer. They'd been building a comprehensive dossier of every vulnerable moment in my life. The most sickening part was realizing how Sarah had orchestrated the timing. She knew about the Series B meeting months in advance, knew how crucial it was for our company's survival. She'd helped me prepare for it, encouraged me to put everything on the line for this one shot at scaling up. And then she'd waited until the exact moment when the damage would be most catastrophic to detonate her little bomb. This feels like a deleted scene from a sitcom, except it's not funny when it's your life exploding in front of you. Sarah had been feeding information to board members for months, framing her updates as concerned observations about my mental health and leadership capabilities. She'd documented every time I seemed stressed, every meeting I'd rescheduled for therapy, every moment of vulnerability during my divorce. She'd built a paper trail that made her look like the responsible employee trying to protect the company from an unstable CEO. The forensic investigation revealed that Sarah had been in contact with at least 3 board members, sending them regular updates about my behavior and suggesting that I might need to step back from day-to-day operations. She'd positioned herself as the ideal interim CEO, someone who already knew the business inside and out, someone who had the trust of the investors and the respect of the employees. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you are watching from in the comments below, because this story is about to get even more insane. The beautiful thing about hiring cybersecurity professionals is that they don't just find out what happened, they find out everything. Sarah's digital footprint revealed months of planning that went far beyond just stealing my photos. She'd been systematically copying confidential company documents, investor communications, and strategic plans. She'd even created fake email accounts to send anonymous tips to tech bloggers about my personal life. But the most damning evidence was a series of encrypted messages between Sarah and someone at a competing startup. She'd been selling our product roadmap, our customer list, and our fundraising strategy to our biggest competitor. The nude photo leak wasn't just about getting me fired, it was about destroying our company's credibility so completely that our competitor could swoop in and poach our best clients and employees. When I confronted Sarah with the evidence, her mask finally slipped. Gone was the concerned, supportive assistant who just wanted what was best for the company. Instead, I was looking at someone who'd been seething with resentment for months. Someone who believed she deserved to be running the company instead of working for someone younger and less experienced. She actually said the quiet part out loud, that she'd been covering for my incompetence for months, and that the investors would thank her once I was gone. The legal aftermath was swift and brutal. Sarah was arrested on charges of computer fraud, corporate espionage, and extortion. The FBI got involved because she'd crossed state lines with some of the stolen data. And apparently this wasn't her first time pulling this kind of corporate sabotage. Turns out those glowing references from her previous jobs were fake, and she'd been fired from Google for similar behavior. My company survived, barely. We had to burn through most of our remaining Series A funding on legal fees and reputation management, but we managed to close a smaller Series B round 6 months later. I implemented new security protocols, hired a proper HR department, and learned to delegate responsibilities without handing over the keys to my entire life. The personal cost was harder to calculate. My divorce got even messier when my ex-husband tried to use the leaked photos against me, though his lawyer eventually advised him that revenge porn victims generally get more sympathy than vindictive ex-husbands. I had to change my phone number, my email address, and basically my entire digital identity. Some of those photos are probably still floating around the internet somewhere, a permanent reminder of how badly I misjudged someone I trusted completely. But here's the thing about surviving something like this. It strips away any illusions you might have had about people's capacity for cruelty, but it also shows you exactly who you are when everything falls apart. I learned that I'm tougher than I thought, more resilient than I believed, and absolutely not going to be intimidated by someone else's jealousy and ambition. Sarah got 18 months in federal prison and 5 years of probation. She'll never work in tech again, and she'll have to live with the knowledge that her elaborate scheme didn't just fail. It backfired so spectacularly that she ended up in prison while I ended up stronger and more successful than ever. The company culture I built in the aftermath of Sarah's betrayal is something I'm actually proud of. We're transparent about mental health, we support each other through personal crises, and we've created systems that prevent any one person from having too much access to sensitive information. My employees know they can come to me with problems without fear of judgment, and I know I can trust them because we've all learned the hard way what betrayal looks like. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone enough rope to hang themselves, and Sarah basically tied the noose with her own hands. She thought she was destroying me, but she actually just revealed her own character to everyone who mattered. The investors who initially panicked about my leadership ended up respecting how I handled the crisis. The employees who were nervous about working for a startup with drama ended up seeing exactly how I protect my team when we're under attack. Speaking of people who abuse positions of trust, wait until you hear about what I discovered my landlord was doing in secret. Moving into my first apartment after college felt like the ultimate adult milestone. I was 24, had just landed my dream job at a marketing firm, and was ready to prove I could handle real responsibility. The apartment wasn't fancy, just a one-bedroom in an older building, but it was mine and the rent was reasonable for the area. My landlord, Dave, seemed like a decent guy during the walkthrough. Mid-50s, friendly enough, owned about 6 rental properties in the neighborhood. He gave me his personal cell number and told me to call any time if I had maintenance issues. The first few months were pretty normal. Dave was responsive when my garbage disposal started making weird noises, and he even upgraded my ancient refrigerator without me asking. He seemed to take pride in maintaining his properties, which I appreciated after hearing horror stories from friends about slumlords who ignored everything until things literally fell apart. The building had mostly young professionals like me, a few grad students, and this really sweet elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who lived on the first floor and always had cookies. But after about 4 months, I started noticing some weird things about the electrical work in my bathroom. There were these tiny holes in the wall that looked freshly drilled, and the light fixture seemed like it had been moved recently. The grout around one of the tiles looked newer than the rest, and there was this almost imperceptible humming sound that only happened when the lights were on. I'm not particularly handy, but I grew up with a dad who was an electrician, so I know what normal electrical work looks like. Initially, I figured Dave had just done some updates before I moved in, and maybe hadn't mentioned them, but the more I looked at it, the more off it seemed. The holes were perfectly positioned to have clear sight lines to the shower and the area around the toilet. They were tiny, maybe the size of a pencil tip, but they were definitely deliberate. I started getting this creepy feeling every time I used the bathroom, like someone might be watching. One night, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I turned off all the lights and used my phone's flashlight to examine those suspicious holes more closely. That's when I saw it, this tiny glass lens reflecting back at me. My heart dropped into my stomach as I realized what I was looking at. Someone had installed a camera in my bathroom wall, positioned to capture everything that happened in there. The immediate reaction was pure rage mixed with violation. Someone had been watching me shower, watching me in my most private moments for months. But as the initial shock wore off, I realized I needed to be smart about this. If I confronted Dave immediately, he could just deny everything and remove the evidence. I needed to figure out the full scope of what was happening before I made any moves. I pretended everything was normal while I started documenting everything. I took photos of the suspicious electrical work, the tiny holes, the mismatched grout. I started paying attention to when Dave would show up for maintenance checks, and noticed he always seemed to have some excuse to come by when I wasn't home. He'd text me afterwards about fixing some minor issue I'd never reported, always mentioning how he'd used his master key to get in while I was at work. But that wasn't even the worst part. I started talking to other tenants in casual conversations, just asking how they liked living in the building and if they'd noticed anything weird. The responses were unsettling. 3 of the young women mentioned feeling uncomfortable in their bathrooms lately. One said she'd noticed her light fixture looked different after a recent electrical upgrade that she'd never requested. Another mentioned that Dave seemed to know details about her schedule that she'd never shared with him. I realized I needed professional help to understand what I was dealing with. I contacted a private investigator who specialized in surveillance cases, and he agreed to do a sweep of my apartment. What he found was horrifying. Not only was there a camera in my bathroom, but there was also one hidden in my bedroom, positioned to capture the area around my bed. Both cameras were connected to a wireless transmitter that was sending footage to an external receiver. The PI explained that this was clearly a professional installation, not some amateur peeping Tom setup. Someone had invested serious money and time into this surveillance system. He also found evidence that the cameras could be accessed remotely, meaning someone could be watching live footage from anywhere with an internet connection. The technical sophistication suggested this wasn't Dave's first time doing this. Armed with this information, I started building a case. I couldn't go to the police yet because I needed to understand the full scope of the operation. The PI helped me set up counter surveillance in my apartment so we could monitor when someone was accessing the cameras. What we discovered was that someone was viewing the footage almost daily, usually in the evenings when people would typically be showering or getting ready for bed. I also started documenting Dave's behavior more carefully. He had this pattern of texting tenants about minor maintenance issues that would require him to enter their apartments, always when they weren't home. He'd mention specific details about their living situations that seemed oddly personal for a landlord. When I looked back through our text conversations, I realized he'd been fishing for information about my work schedule, my dating life, and my daily routines. Then came the breaking point. I decided to test my theory by telling Dave I was going out of town for the weekend, but actually staying in my apartment to see what would happen. Sure enough, on Saturday afternoon, I heard someone entering my apartment with a key. I hid in my closet and watched through a crack in the door as Dave came into my bedroom. Not to fix anything, but to adjust the angle of the hidden camera. The level of violation was beyond anything I could have imagined. This man had been systematically invading the privacy of his tenants, treating us like we were entertainment for his sick fantasies. But I knew that confronting him directly would just lead to denial and evidence destruction. I needed to coordinate with other tenants and gather enough evidence to ensure he'd face real consequences. I started reaching out to the other young women in the building more deliberately. I shared what I'd discovered and asked if they'd be willing to have their apartments checked for surveillance equipment. The response was immediate and unanimous. Everyone wanted to know if they were being watched. We organized a building meeting for a Sunday evening, when Dave typically wasn't around. The meeting was surreal. 8 of us gathered in Mrs. Chen's apartment, and as we compared notes, a clear pattern emerged. Dave had been targeting young women almost exclusively, always finding excuses to enter their apartments for maintenance that never seemed to actually fix anything. Several tenants mentioned feeling like their personal belongings had been moved slightly, or finding evidence that someone had been in their apartment when they were away. 3 more tenants agreed to have surveillance sweeps done, and the results were horrifying. Every single apartment occupied by a young woman had cameras installed, not just in bathrooms, but also in bedrooms and living rooms. Dave had created his own personal reality show, starring his unsuspecting tenants. The cameras in the common areas captured people coming and going, probably so he could coordinate his viewing schedule with people's routines. And here's where it gets absurd. While we were discovering the extent of Dave's surveillance network, he started getting suspicious about why so many tenants were suddenly asking maintenance questions. He began showing up unannounced more frequently, claiming he was doing routine inspections. During one of these visits, he actually asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual about my apartment lately, with this creepy smile that made my skin crawl. The private investigator we'd hired managed to trace the wireless signals from the cameras to a receiver in Dave's own apartment, which was in the basement of the building next door. But, even more disturbing, he discovered that the footage was being uploaded to several online platforms, where it was being sold as real voyeur content. Dave wasn't just violating our privacy for his own entertainment, he was literally profiting from our most intimate moments. When we realized Dave was selling footage of us online, the violation became something else entirely. This wasn't just some creepy landlord with boundary issues. This was a criminal enterprise built on the systematic exploitation of young women who thought they were safe in their own homes. The fact that strangers around the world had been watching us shower, sleep, and live our private lives was almost too much to process. The turning point came when Dave started getting more aggressive about his inspections. He began insisting on entering apartments even when tenants were home, claiming he needed to check for safety violations. When one of my neighbors refused to let him in, he threatened eviction for non-cooperation with essential maintenance. That's when we knew we had to act before he either destroyed evidence or escalated his behavior. We coordinated with the police to ensure they'd have everything they needed for a solid case. The private investigator had documented the camera locations, the wireless network setup, and the online distribution of the footage. We had testimony from 8 tenants about Dave's suspicious behavior and unauthorized entry into their apartments. We even had evidence that he'd been accessing the camera feeds during specific times when he knew we'd be in states of undress. The morning we executed our plan was terrifying and satisfying in equal measure. I called Dave and told him there was a water leak in my bathroom that needed immediate attention. When he arrived with his toolbox, he found me waiting with 2 police officers and a detective who specialized in voyeurism cases. The look on his face when he realized he'd been caught was something I'll never forget. This mixture of panic and rage and disbelief. Dave's first instinct was to deny everything, claiming the cameras must have been installed by the previous owner and he had no idea they existed. But when the officers showed him photographs of the wireless network and evidence of the remote access, he switched tactics. He actually tried to claim that the cameras were for security purposes, to protect his property from tenant damage and theft. Imagine being this confidently wrong about what constitutes legal security measures. The detective patiently explained that landlords cannot legally install cameras in private areas like bathrooms and bedrooms without explicit consent, and they certainly can't distribute footage online for profit. Dave kept insisting that we were overreacting and that he was just protecting his investment. When the officers arrested Dave, he actually had the audacity to threaten all of us with eviction for harassment and false accusations. Even as they were putting handcuffs on him, he was yelling about how we'd all be homeless within 30 days, and he'd make sure we could never rent anywhere else in the city. The detective informed him that threatening witnesses tends to result in additional charges. The investigation that followed was extensive and horrifying. Police discovered that Dave had been running this operation across all 6 of his rental properties, with cameras installed in dozens of apartments over the past 3 years. They found thousands of hours of footage stored on his computers, organized by tenant and categorized by content type. Some of the files had names like shower compilation and bedroom activities that made it clear this was far more than just security monitoring. The federal charges came down like a hammer. Dave was facing counts of voyeurism, distribution of intimate images without consent, invasion of privacy, wire fraud for selling the footage online, and racketeering for running a criminal enterprise. The FBI got involved because he'd been distributing content across state lines, and they discovered he'd been part of a larger network of landlords who were sharing techniques and footage. The civil lawsuits were equally devastating. All 8 tenants sued for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, and violation of housing rights. The court awarded damages that totaled more than the value of all Dave's properties combined. He was forced to sell everything to pay the settlements, and he'll be paying off the judgments for the rest of his life. But the most satisfying part was how completely his life unraveled once the story became public. Dave had been married for 22 years, and his wife left him as soon as she learned about his activities. His adult children cut off all contact. He lost his real estate licenses and will never be able to work in property management again. The community where he'd been seen as a successful businessman now knows him as the pervert who violated his tenants' most private moments. The ripple effects extended beyond just Dave's properties. Our case prompted investigations into several other landlords in the area. A new legislation was passed requiring annual inspections for surveillance equipment in rental properties. The apartment building was sold to a management company that immediately upgraded all the security systems and implemented strict policies about tenant privacy. For me personally, the healing process took months. I had to move out of that apartment because I could never feel safe there again, knowing that my most private moments had been recorded and distributed online. I spent thousands on therapy to deal with the violation and paranoia that came with knowing strangers had been watching me in my own home. There are probably still videos of me floating around the internet somewhere, a permanent reminder of how someone I trusted betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. But there's something empowering about fighting back against someone who thinks they can exploit you with impunity. Dave thought he was untouchable because he held power over our housing situation. He counted on us being too embarrassed or intimidated to speak up about what he was doing. Instead, we organized, gathered evidence, and made sure he faced real consequences for his actions. The other tenants and I still keep in touch, bonded by this bizarre shared experience of having our privacy violated by the same predator. We've all moved on to better living situations, but we remain vigilant about signs of surveillance, and we advocate for stronger tenant protection laws. What we went through was horrible, but at least we made sure no future tenants will have to endure the same violation. Trust can be shattered in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the people closest to us are hiding the darkest secrets. I never thought my 19-year-old son would be the one to destroy my life, but here we are. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. My father had been battling pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and the doctors were saying he had maybe 6 weeks left. The whole family was struggling with watching this strong, stubborn man who'd built a construction empire from nothing slowly waste away in a hospital bed. My marriage to Linda had been rocky for years, the kind of slow deterioration that happens when two people grow apart but stay together out of habit and fear of change. We'd been going through the motions for probably 5 years, sleeping in the same bed, but living completely separate lives. The stress of Dad's illness just made everything worse. Linda threw herself into caregiving mode, practically living at the hospital, while I tried to keep Dad's business running and manage my own job at the engineering firm. That's how I ended up spending so much time with Jessica, my co-worker who'd been assigned to the same infrastructure project. She was smart, funny, and most importantly, she didn't look at me with that mixture of pity and resentment that had become Linda's default expression. Jessica actually listened when I talked about the pressure of watching my father die while trying to hold everything else together. She didn't make me feel guilty for needing a break from the constant heaviness that had settled over my family. The affair started gradually, the way these things usually do. Long lunches that turned into longer conversations. Staying late at the office to work on projects that could have easily been finished the next day. Jessica understood the stress I was under in a way that Linda couldn't or wouldn't. When Jessica suggested we grab dinner after a particularly brutal day at the hospital, it felt natural. When dinner led to drinks and drinks led to her apartment, it felt inevitable. I justified it by telling myself that my marriage was already over, that Linda and I were just waiting for Dad to pass before we dealt with our own problems. I convinced myself that what I was doing with Jessica wasn't really cheating, because there was no emotional connection left with Linda anyway. These are the lies we tell ourselves when we want to do something we know is wrong, but can't resist the temporary relief it provides. My son Marcus had always been close to his grandfather. Dad had basically raised him while I was building my career, teaching him woodworking and construction skills, taking him on job sites, treating him more like a business partner than a grandchild. When Dad got sick, Marcus took it harder than anyone. He'd spend hours at the hospital reading to his grandfather, or just sitting quietly while Dad slept. It was actually beautiful to watch, this bond between them that transcended the typical grandfather-grandson relationship. Dad had always been open about his intentions regarding his estate. Marcus was getting the bulk of it, the construction company, the real estate investments, probably close to $2 million total. Dad believed in rewarding loyalty and hard work, and Marcus had shown both throughout his childhood and teenage years. Linda and I would get something, but Dad wanted to make sure his favorite grandchild was set for life. About 3 weeks into my affair with Jessica, I started noticing that Marcus was acting differently around me. He'd always been a pretty straightforward kid, the type to say exactly what he was thinking, but suddenly he was asking these weird, probing questions about my work schedule. He wanted to know why I was staying late so often, why I seemed distracted when we visited Grandpa, why I was always checking my phone during family dinners. I assumed it was grief making him hyper-vigilant about family dynamics. Losing someone you love makes you notice things you might normally overlook, makes you desperate to hold on to the people you still have. I figured Marcus was just worried about our family falling apart after Dad died, which wasn't entirely wrong, just not for the reasons I thought he suspected. The questions got more specific over time. Marcus would ask about particular days, wanting to know exactly where I'd been and what I'd been working on. He'd mentioned seeing my car in different parts of town, always framed as casual observations, but with an undertone that made me uncomfortable. When I explained that I'd been at client meetings or job sites, he'd nod and change the subject, but I could see him filing the information away. But that wasn't even the worst part. Marcus started insisting on spending more time together as a family, particularly at the hospital. He'd coordinate with Linda to make sure we were all there for Dad's evening visits, creating these forced family bonding moments that felt increasingly awkward. I was juggling my affair with Jessica, my dying father's medical appointments, and my son's sudden need for family togetherness. Looking back, I should have recognized that Marcus was conducting his own investigation. The kid had always been methodical, the type who researched everything thoroughly before making decisions. When he was 16 and wanted a car, he presented me with a spreadsheet comparing insurance costs, maintenance records, and resale values for different models. I should have realized he'd bring that same analytical approach to figuring out why his father was acting suspicious during the most important family crisis of their lives. The affair with Jessica intensified as Dad's condition worsened. The worse things got at the hospital, the more I needed the escape she provided. We started meeting during lunch breaks, finding excuses to work late together, even spending occasional weekends at her apartment when I told Linda I was dealing with business emergencies for Dad's company. Jessica became my refuge from the overwhelming sadness and responsibility that dominated every other aspect of my life. Marcus's behavior became increasingly strange during this period. He'd offer to run errands for me, particularly ones that would take me near Jessica's neighborhood. He'd suggest family activities that required me to account for my time in very specific ways. Once, he even showed up at my office unannounced, claiming he wanted to bring me lunch but spending the whole visit looking around like he was cataloging details. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when the whole family had gathered at the hospital for what the doctors said might be one of Dad's last coherent days. Linda was there, along with my sister and her husband, my brother who'd flown in from Seattle, and Marcus. Dad was weak but alert, talking quietly with each of us about memories and regrets and all the heavy conversations that happen when someone is dying. It should have been a sacred moment, this final gathering of people who love my father. Instead, it became the setting for the most devastating betrayal I've ever experienced. Marcus had been quiet most of the evening, just holding Dad's hand and listening to the adults talk. But as we were preparing to leave, he suddenly stood up and cleared his throat, like he had an announcement to make. The words that came out of his mouth shattered everything I thought I knew about my son and my family. Marcus looked directly at me and said he had something important to tell Grandpa, before it was too late. Then he pulled out his phone and started showing Dad photos of me and Jessica together. Photos that had clearly been taken from a distance, with a telephoto lens or through restaurant windows. The room went completely silent except for the beeping of Dad's monitors. Marcus had photos of me and Jessica, holding hands across a dinner table, kissing in the parking lot of her apartment complex, even one of us leaving a hotel together during what I'd told Linda was a business trip. He'd been systematically documenting my affair for weeks, building a case against me with the same thoroughness he'd once applied to researching that car purchase. And here's where it gets absurd. Marcus didn't just have photos, he had a complete timeline of my activities cross-referenced with the lies I'd told Linda about where I was. He'd been tracking my location using the family phone plan, comparing my actual whereabouts with what I'd claimed to be doing. He'd even recorded some of our phone conversations where I'd made up stories about work emergencies or late meetings. My father, dying in his hospital bed, listened to his grandson methodically destroy his son's reputation and marriage with the kind of evidence that would hold up in court. Dad's face went through a range of emotions as Marcus presented his case, disappointment and anger, and something that looked like disgust. Linda just sat there in shock, occasionally asking clarifying questions like she was trying to understand the logistics of how her husband had been lying to her for months. The most devastating part was watching my son explain his motivations with this cold, calculated logic that made my blood run cold. Marcus said he'd suspected something was wrong when I started acting differently during Grandpa's illness. He'd noticed I was distracted and emotionally distant during family visits, more concerned with my phone than with spending quality time with Dad in his final weeks. Marcus told the room that he'd initially planned to confront me privately, but then he'd realized that my affair wasn't just about cheating on Mom, it was about stealing emotional energy from the family during the most important time in Grandpa's life. He said I was being selfish and disrespectful to everyone who was grieving, using Dad's illness as cover for my own entertainment. The kid actually said that last part, that I was using my father's terminal cancer diagnosis as cover for my affair. And the worst part was, he wasn't wrong. I had been using Dad's illness as an excuse to spend time with Jessica, telling Linda I needed space to process my grief when I was really just avoiding the responsibility of being present for my family. What happened next felt like watching my entire life implode in slow motion. Dad, summoning energy from somewhere deep inside his failing body, asked everyone except Marcus to leave the room. From the hallway, we could hear him talking to his grandson in quiet, serious tones for about 20 minutes. When Marcus finally came out, he had tears in his eyes, but also this satisfied expression that made me want to shake him. Linda didn't say a word to me during the drive home. When we got to the house, she went straight to our bedroom and started packing a suitcase. The only thing she said was that she'd be staying at her sister's house until she could figure out what to do next. She took her wedding ring off and left it on the kitchen counter, right next to the grocery list and the unopened mail, like it was just another household item that had lost its purpose. The next morning, Dad's lawyer called to schedule a meeting about updating the will. When I arrived at his office, Marcus was already there, looking more adult than I'd ever seen him. The lawyer explained that Dad wanted to make some changes to ensure his estate would be distributed according to his current wishes, given new information about family dynamics. Dad had decided to leave everything directly to Marcus, bypassing me entirely. The construction company, the investment properties, the savings accounts, all of it would go to his grandson when he turned 25, with a trust fund providing monthly payments until then. I would inherit Dad's old tools and his pickup truck, items that had sentimental value but no real financial worth. The lawyer handed me a letter from Dad, written in the shaky handwriting of someone fighting through medication and pain. The letter was brutal in its honesty. Dad said he'd built his business on trust and integrity, values that he'd tried to pass on to his children. He was disappointed that I'd chosen to lie and cheat during the most difficult time in our family's history, when we should have been supporting each other. Dad's letter explained that he'd always planned to leave most of his estate to Marcus anyway, but now he was doing it for different reasons. Instead of rewarding a beloved grandchild, he was protecting family assets from someone who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with important responsibilities. Dad said he hoped I'd use this as an opportunity to rebuild my character, but he wasn't going to risk his life's work on that possibility. The most painful part of the letter was Dad's observation that Marcus had shown more maturity and family loyalty at 19 than I'd demonstrated at 45. Dad wrote that he was proud of his grandson for having the courage to speak up about something that was hurting the family, even though it meant betraying his own father. That level of moral clarity, Dad said, was exactly the kind of character he wanted managing his legacy. Marcus never apologized for exposing my affair, and frankly, I don't think he should have. When I confronted him about the surveillance and the calculated way he'd destroyed my marriage and inheritance, he just shrugged and said he was protecting the family from my selfishness. He said Grandpa deserved to know the truth about who his son really was before he died. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Linda's lawyer used Marcus's evidence to demonstrate my infidelity, which affected everything from property division to spousal support. Jessica and I tried to continue our relationship after everything exploded, but it turns out that romance built on deception and escapism doesn't survive well in the harsh light of reality. She eventually transferred to a different department and stopped returning my calls. Dad passed away 6 weeks after the hospital confrontation, and Marcus delivered the eulogy at the funeral. He talked about his grandfather's integrity, his work ethic, and his commitment to family values. He never mentioned me by name, but everyone in that church understood the subtext. I sat in the front row listening to my son praise the man who disowned me, feeling like a stranger at my own father's funeral. The aftermath was a masterclass in how quickly a life can unravel when built on lies. I lost my marriage, my inheritance, my relationship with my extended family, and most painfully, the respect of my son. Marcus moved in with Linda after the divorce, and they've built this new family dynamic that doesn't include me. My sister and brother barely speak to me, and family gatherings happen without my knowledge or invitation. The construction company that Dad built from nothing is now being managed by trustees until Marcus is old enough to take full control. My son spends his weekends learning the business, working alongside the crews that Dad used to supervise, preparing to inherit a legacy that should have included me. He's studying business and construction management in college, funded by the trust fund that Dad established with money that I'd always assumed would partially be mine. Looking back, I understand that Marcus didn't just expose my affair to secure his inheritance, though that was certainly part of it. He genuinely believed he was protecting our family from someone who was causing harm during a crisis. In his 19-year-old mind, I wasn't just cheating on his mother, I was betraying the family when we most needed to stick together. The irony is that Marcus got exactly what he wanted. Dad's assets are protected from my poor judgment. Linda is free from a marriage that was making her miserable, and the family has moved on without the person who was causing drama during their darkest time. My son orchestrated the complete restructuring of our family dynamics, and everyone except me seems happier for it. I see Marcus occasionally, usually at public events where avoiding each other would be awkward. He's polite but distant, treating me like a distant relative rather than the father who raised him. He's grown into this confident young man who owns successful businesses and commands respect in our community, everything Dad hoped he would become. Meanwhile, I'm starting over at 45, learning to build a life that doesn't depend on other people's money or approval. The hardest part is accepting that my son was right about everything. I was being selfish during Dad's illness. I was lying to my family during a time when honesty mattered most, and I was prioritizing my own needs over everyone else's emotional well-being. Marcus saw through all my rationalizations and justifications, and he had the courage to hold me accountable when no one else would. Family betrayal cuts deep, but sometimes it takes a medical crisis to reveal who people really are. When my brother Mike married Emma 5 years ago, I thought she was a little dramatic, but harmless enough. She was the type of person who always had some crisis going on, whether it was job drama, friendship issues, or mysterious health problems that never quite had clear diagnoses. Mike seemed to thrive on being her rescuer, so I figured it worked for them even if it exhausted the rest of us. Everything changed 8 months ago when Emma announced she'd been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The whole family rallied around her immediately, which is what you do when someone you love gets hit with news like that. My parents started cooking meals for her and Mike every week. My sister organized a meal train with their church group. I set up a GoFundMe that raised almost $15,000 in the first month. Emma had this whole narrative about her treatment plan that sounded legitimate enough. She was supposedly going to a private oncology center downtown because her insurance had better coverage there, and she'd hired a private nurse named Maria to help coordinate her care and accompany her to appointments. Emma explained that having a dedicated advocate was crucial for getting the best treatment, and Maria had experience with breast cancer patients specifically. The fundraising efforts intensified as Emma's treatment supposedly progressed. She needed money for experimental therapies that insurance wouldn't cover, special supplements, organic food, and Maria's services. Between the GoFundMe, family contributions, and a benefit dinner organized by Mike's co-workers, we'd raised over $50,000 by month 6. Everyone felt good about supporting Emma through her fight. I started noticing weird inconsistencies around month 4. Emma would talk about how exhausting her chemo sessions were, but she always looked amazing when I saw her. Her hair was thick and shiny, her skin was glowing, and she seemed to have more energy than she'd had before her diagnosis. When I mentioned this to Mike, he said the private treatment center was using cutting-edge protocols that minimized side effects. Emma's stories about her treatment started getting more elaborate and contradictory. She'd mentioned specific medications that didn't sound right when I looked them up, or she'd described procedures that seemed inconsistent with what I knew about cancer treatment. When I asked direct questions about her doctors or treatment schedule, she'd get emotional and say that talking about it was too traumatic, or she'd change the subject to how grateful she was for everyone's support. The red flag that really got my attention was Maria, Emma's supposed private nurse. Every time I saw them together, Maria seemed more like a friend than a medical professional. She didn't carry herself with the competence and authority I'd expect from someone managing cancer treatment. Her medical knowledge seemed superficial, and she'd defer to Emma on questions about treatment details that a nurse should have known better than the patient. But that wasn't even the worst part. I decided to do some casual investigating after Emma made a comment about how Maria had helped other families navigate cancer treatment. When I tried to look up Maria's nursing credentials through the state licensing board, I couldn't find any record of her. When I asked Emma for Maria's last name so I could write her a thank you card for all her help, Emma got flustered and gave me different spellings on different occasions. I started paying closer attention to Emma's behavior at family gatherings. She'd talk about being tired from treatment, but then she'd be the last person to leave, full of energy and enthusiasm. She'd mention specific symptoms she was experiencing, but they never seemed to affect her actual activities. She was supposedly going through intensive chemotherapy, but she never missed social events, never seemed nauseous, and never had the kind of fatigue that cancer patients describe. The breaking point came when I offered to drive Emma to one of her treatment appointments. I thought it would be a nice gesture, and I was genuinely curious to meet her medical team and understand her treatment better. Emma immediately got defensive, saying that Maria always drove her and that having too many people involved would be disruptive to her care routine. When I pressed the issue, Emma claimed that the treatment center had strict policies about visitors and that bringing someone new would require advance approval from her medical team. She got increasingly agitated as I asked follow-up questions, finally saying that my questions were stressing her out and stress was bad for cancer patients. Mike backed her up, saying I was being insensitive and needed to respect Emma's boundaries about her medical care. I decided to drive by the treatment center Emma claimed to be using, just to see what kind of facility it was. The address she'd given us was a small office building with a few medical practices, but none of them were oncology centers. When I called the directory and asked about cancer treatment services, they had no idea what I was talking about. The closest thing was a dermatology practice that did skin cancer screenings. That's when I realized Emma was lying about everything, but I needed proof before I could accuse her of faking cancer for money. I came up with a plan to test my theory by hiring Maria privately for a legitimate purpose. My elderly mother had been struggling with mobility issues, and I thought it would be perfect to see if Maria was actually qualified to provide medical care. I called Emma and asked if Maria might be available for some private nursing work with my mother. I explained that Mom needed help with medication management and basic health monitoring. Nothing too intensive. Emma seemed nervous about the idea, but she eventually gave me Maria's phone number after I offered to pay premium rates for her services. When I called Maria directly, she seemed eager to take on additional work. We arranged to meet at my mother's house so she could assess Mom's needs, and we could discuss care plans. I was preparing to expose a fake nurse, but what I discovered was so much worse than I'd imagined. Maria showed up at my mother's house dressed professionally, carrying a bag that looked medical, and presenting herself with confidence that almost made me doubt my suspicions. But within 10 minutes of conversation, it became clear she had no medical training whatsoever. She couldn't answer basic questions about blood pressure monitoring, she didn't know common medication interactions, and she suggested treatments that were clearly nonsensical. And here's where it gets absurd. When I confronted Maria about her lack of medical knowledge, she completely broke down and confessed everything. Turns out Maria wasn't Emma's nurse, she was Emma's roommate and acting partner. They'd been running this cancer scam not just on our family, but on multiple families across the city for the past 2 years. Maria explained their entire operation with the kind of detail that made it clear this was a sophisticated fraud scheme. Emma would infiltrate social circles, usually through relationships or community involvement, and establish herself as a likable person with minor health concerns. Then she'd escalate to a cancer diagnosis, always choosing types and stages that would generate maximum sympathy and fundraising potential. Maria's role was to play the dedicated private nurse, lending credibility to Emma's medical claims and helping maintain the illusion of ongoing treatment. She'd learned enough medical terminology to sound convincing in casual conversation, but she'd never actually provided medical care to anyone. They'd developed an entire repertoire of fake medical scenarios and treatment narratives. The most disturbing part was learning about their other victims. Maria showed me a notebook where they'd tracked different families, noting which approaches worked best for fundraising and how long they could maintain each scam before moving on. They'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from families who thought they were helping someone fight for their life. Maria was ready to cooperate fully because she was terrified of criminal charges and because Emma had been pressuring her to target bigger victims with more money. She'd been documenting everything as insurance against Emma, trying to pin the whole scheme on her if they got caught. She had photos, text messages, and financial records that proved Emma was the mastermind behind their operation. What happened next required careful planning because I wanted to expose Emma publicly in a way that would prevent her from just disappearing and starting the scam somewhere else. Emma had organized a fundraiser dinner for the following weekend, supposedly to raise money for a new experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. I realized this would be the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth to everyone who'd been supporting her. I coordinated with Maria to gather all the evidence of their fraud, and I contacted the police to make sure they'd be ready to arrest Emma when everything was exposed. Maria was nervous about betraying Emma, but she was more afraid of being charged as an accessory to multiple counts of fraud. The detective assigned to the case said this was one of the most elaborate charity scams they'd seen. The fundraiser dinner was held at a nice restaurant that Mike had rented out for the evening. About 60 people showed up, including family, friends, co-workers, and community members who'd been supporting Emma's supposed cancer battle. Emma gave this tearful speech about how grateful she was for everyone's support during her darkest time. Then came the breaking point. I stood up and asked Emma to introduce Maria, her private nurse who'd been so crucial to her care. Emma looked nervous, but she had no choice but to play along. When Maria took the microphone, instead of talking about Emma's medical progress, she confessed to everyone that the entire cancer diagnosis was fake. The room went completely silent as Maria explained how she and Emma had been running this scam for 8 months, stealing money from people who genuinely wanted to help someone fight cancer. She showed photos on her phone of their planning notebooks, their fake medical scenarios, and evidence of their other victims. Emma tried to run, but the police officers I'd coordinated with were waiting by the exits. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Emma. She was arrested on charges of fraud, theft by deception, and identity theft for using fake medical credentials. The investigation revealed that she and Maria had stolen over $300,000 from various families and charitable organizations over 2 years. Emma faced federal charges because some of the fraud had crossed state lines. The civil lawsuits came next. Every family that had donated money sued to recover their contributions, plus damages for emotional distress. Emma was forced to liquidate all her assets, but she'd already spent most of the money on lifestyle expenses rather than saving it. She'll be paying restitution for decades, assuming she ever makes enough money to pay anything significant. Mike filed for divorce immediately, claiming he'd had no knowledge of Emma's fraud scheme. The investigation supported his claims, showing that Emma had been lying to him as extensively as she'd lied to everyone else. Mike was devastated by the betrayal, but also relieved to learn that his wife wasn't actually dying of cancer. The family dynamics shifted dramatically after Emma's exposure. My parents were heartbroken that they'd been manipulated by someone they'd welcomed into the family and trusted with their emotions and money. My sister felt guilty that she'd organized so many fundraising events based on lies. Everyone was angry, but also somehow relieved that the person we'd been grieving wasn't actually dying. Maria received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation with the investigation of other fraud cases. She testified against Emma and provided evidence that helped prosecutors build cases against other scam artists using similar techniques. She's forbidden from working in any medical or caregiving capacity and has to pay restitution to all the families they defrauded. The most disturbing revelation was learning how common these fake illness scams have become. The detective explained that social media and online fundraising platforms have made it easier for criminals to find sympathetic victims and build elaborate false narratives. Emma and Maria were part of a larger network of scammers who shared techniques and target information. For me personally, the experience was a masterclass in trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. I'd noticed inconsistencies in Emma's story for months, but I'd dismissed my concerns because questioning someone's cancer diagnosis felt cruel and suspicious. I learned that criminals count on people's reluctance to investigate claims that seem too horrible to fake. The ripple effects of Emma's fraud extended far beyond just the money she stole. Families who'd emotionally invested in her supposed battle with cancer felt betrayed and manipulated in ways that affected their ability to trust people with genuine medical crises. Some people became skeptical of legitimate fundraising efforts, which hurt real families dealing with actual medical emergencies. The fundraising platforms eventually refunded most of the donations once the fraud was proven, but the emotional damage was harder to repair. People had grieved for Emma, worried about her future, and celebrated her supposed progress through treatment. Learning that all those emotions had been manufactured for financial gain left everyone feeling violated and suspicious. Looking back, I'm proud that I trusted my instincts and investigated when something felt wrong, even though it meant discovering that my sister-in-law was a criminal who'd been manipulating my family for months. The truth was painful, but it was better than continuing to be victims of an elaborate fraud that showed no signs of ending voluntarily. Deception in families can run deeper than anyone imagines, and sometimes children are the masterminds behind the cruelest schemes. Losing my wife Sarah to breast cancer 3 years ago nearly destroyed me. But watching our 17-year-old daughter Madison grieve her mother while trying to hold our family together was somehow even more heartbreaking. For 2 years, it was just the two of us figuring out how to navigate life without the woman who'd been the center of our universe. Madison stepped up in ways that no teenager should have to, managing household logistics and emotional support with a maturity that amazed and worried me. When I met Linda at a work conference 18 months after Sarah's death, I wasn't looking for love. I was barely managing to function as a single father while keeping my consulting business afloat. But Linda was patient and understanding about my complicated situation. She'd never been married or had children, but she seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of our small family. Madison was polite to Linda during their early interactions, but distant in the way teenagers often are with their parents' new partners. Linda and I took things slowly, partly because I was terrified of disrupting the fragile stability Madison and I had built together. We dated for 6 months before I introduced them properly, and even then I was careful not to rush into anything that might feel threatening to Madison. Linda was respectful of boundaries, never trying to replace Sarah or act like an instant mother figure. She focused on building her own relationship with Madison, based on mutual respect rather than forced intimacy. The engagement happened after we'd been together for almost a year. Linda had become a steady presence in our lives, someone who brought laughter and lightness back into our house without trying to erase Sarah's memory. Madison seemed to be adjusting well to the idea of Linda becoming her stepmother. She'd even started asking Linda for advice about college applications and boy problems, which felt like progress toward accepting her as family. Planning the wedding became a bonding activity for all three of us. Madison insisted on helping choose flowers, venue decorations, and even Linda's dress. She seemed excited about the ceremony and reception, making suggestions with enthusiasm that surprised me after months of polite but reserved interactions. Linda was thrilled that Madison was warming up to her, and I started believing we might actually succeed at blending our unconventional family. The wedding was scheduled for early June, with a small ceremony followed by a dinner reception for close family and friends. Madison had agreed to be Linda's maid of honor, which felt like a huge step forward in their relationship. Linda was nervous about the responsibility of becoming a stepmother, but Madison's apparent acceptance seemed to give her confidence that we could make this work. About 4 months before the wedding, I noticed Linda's fiancé David started spending more time on his phone and social media. David was Linda's best friend from college who'd agreed to officiate our ceremony since he'd gotten ordained online for another friend's wedding. He'd always been friendly and supportive of our relationship, so I didn't think much of his increased phone usage. Everyone's always on their devices anyway, and wedding planning involves a lot of coordination. Madison's behavior also started changing around this time, but in ways that seemed positive. She was more engaged in conversation during family dinners, asking Linda detailed questions about her work as a photographer, and showing genuine interest in her creative projects. Madison even started following Linda's professional Instagram account and commenting supportively on her posts. It felt like they were finally developing the kind of relationship I'd hoped for. But that wasn't even the worst part. Madison had been carefully studying Linda's interests, personality, and background through months of conversations and social media stalking. She was building a detailed psychological profile that would allow her to create the perfect fake romantic interest for David. Madison had always been analytically minded, the type of kid who researched everything thoroughly before making decisions, but I never imagined she'd apply those skills to sabotaging my relationship. The fake Instagram account Madison created for Ashley was incredibly sophisticated. She used stock photos of an attractive brunette photographer, created a believable backstory with details that would appeal specifically to David, and filled the profile with artistic content that showcased interests she knew he'd find attractive. Ashley was supposedly 25, lived in a nearby city, and worked as a freelance photographer specializing in nature and travel photography. Madison's manipulation was diabolical in its precision. She'd pay attention to David's comments during family conversations, then have Ashley reach out to him about topics he'd expressed interest in. If David mentioned a band he liked, Ashley would post about going to their concert. If he talked about wanting to visit a particular city, Ashley would share photos from that location. She was creating the illusion that they had uncanny compatibility based on information she'd gathered as his future stepdaughter. The emotional affair between David and Ashley developed over several months, with Madison carefully escalating their online relationship at a pace that felt natural. She'd start with likes on his posts, progress to commenting on his photos, then slide into his direct messages about their shared interests. Madison was patient and strategic, building trust and romantic tension gradually while David convinced himself he was just making a new friend online. David started mentioning Ashley in casual conversation, talking about this photographer he'd connected with on social media, who had such interesting perspectives on art and travel. Linda would nod politely, but I could see she was slightly bothered by how often David brought up this online acquaintance. Madison would participate in these conversations, asking innocent questions that encouraged David to share more details about his interactions with Ashley. The breaking point came when Madison realized David was emotionally invested enough in Ashley to consider meeting her in person. He'd started talking about a photography workshop that Ashley had supposedly recommended, located conveniently close to where she claimed to live. Madison knew she had to execute her plan before David discovered that Ashley didn't exist, which would ruin the evidence of his willingness to emotionally cheat on Linda. Madison's timing was ruthlessly perfect. She waited until the rehearsal dinner, when all our family and friends were gathered in one place, including David and Linda's extended network. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of our upcoming marriage, with toasts and speeches from people who'd supported our relationship through its development. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most calculated betrayals I've ever witnessed. During the dinner, when everyone was relaxed and happy, Madison stood up and asked for everyone's attention. She said she had something important to share about the upcoming wedding that everyone needed to know. Linda and I exchanged confused glances, assuming Madison was going to give some kind of heartfelt speech about accepting Linda into our family. Instead, Madison pulled out her phone and started showing the room months of flirty messages between David and Ashley. She'd screenshotted everything, including photos David had sent to Ashley, romantic messages where he'd expressed dissatisfaction with his own dating life, and conversations where he'd talked about being attracted to someone who really understood his artistic vision. And here's where it gets absurd. Madison didn't just reveal the messages, she explained to everyone exactly how she'd created the Ashley persona, specifically to test David's loyalty to Linda. She walked the room through her methodology like she was presenting a research project, showing how she'd used information gathered from family conversations to create Ashley's perfect compatibility with David. The room went completely silent as Madison demonstrated the sophistication of her catfishing operation. She showed everyone the fake Instagram account, the carefully curated photos and posts, the strategic timeline of their relationship development. She documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who'd planned this revelation from the beginning. David's face went through a range of emotions as he realized he'd been manipulated by a 17-year-old, but also that his private conversations were being shared with everyone he knew. Linda looked devastated, not just by David's emotional affair, but by the realization that Madison had been planning to sabotage the wedding for months while pretending to be supportive. Madison's explanation for her actions was delivered with the cold logic of someone who genuinely believed she was protecting her family. She said she'd noticed how David looked at other women, how he seemed restless and uncommitted despite agreeing to officiate our wedding. She'd created Ashley to test whether he could be trusted with Linda's heart, and he'd failed spectacularly. What happened next felt like watching my entire wedding implode in real time. Linda confronted David about the messages, many of which revealed his doubts about her career choices and his attraction to other women. David tried to defend himself by pointing out that Ashley wasn't real, but that just highlighted how quickly he'd been willing to pursue someone he thought might be a better match than Linda. Linda made the decision to call off the wedding before the evening was over. She said she couldn't marry someone who'd been emotionally cheating on her for months, regardless of whether the other woman was real. She also said she couldn't become part of a family where a teenager was capable of such sophisticated manipulation and deception. The aftermath was brutal for everyone involved. David was humiliated by having his private conversations exposed publicly, but he also couldn't deny that he'd been emotionally unfaithful to Linda. Linda felt betrayed by both David's willingness to cheat and Madison's months of calculated deception while pretending to accept her into our family. My relationship with Madison became incredibly complicated after her revelation. On one hand, I was furious that she'd sabotaged my chance at happiness and put Linda through such public humiliation. On the other hand, I couldn't deny that she'd exposed David's lack of commitment to Linda, potentially saving her from a marriage to someone who wasn't fully invested in their relationship. Madison never apologized for her actions, insisting that she'd saved both Linda and me from making a mistake. She argued that if David was willing to emotionally cheat with a stranger on Instagram, he probably would have cheated eventually anyway. Madison said she'd rather expose his character flaws before the wedding than watch Linda get hurt later in their marriage. The psychological complexity of what Madison had done was staggering. She'd simultaneously protected and destroyed our family's chance at happiness, using skills that demonstrated both emotional intelligence and manipulative capability that worried me as her father. Madison had grieved her mother by becoming hypervigilant about protecting what remained of our family, even if her protection methods were ethically questionable. Linda and I tried to salvage our relationship after David's betrayal was exposed, but the damage was too extensive. She couldn't trust Madison after months of calculated deception, and she couldn't feel comfortable joining a family where emotional manipulation was used as a problem-solving strategy. Linda also struggled with knowing that David had been attracted to characteristics Madison had specifically crafted to appeal to him. The most painful realization was that Madison's plan had worked exactly as she'd intended. She'd identified a potential threat to our family stability and eliminated it using methods that ensured Linda would never want to marry me. Madison had chosen protecting our two-person family unit over allowing it to expand, and she'd succeeded completely. Madison and I spent months in family therapy, trying to process what had happened and rebuild trust between us. The therapist helped me understand that Madison's actions came from grief and fear of losing another parent figure, but they also represented a level of emotional manipulation that needed to be addressed before it became a permanent pattern in her relationships. The wedding vendors were understanding about the cancellation, though we lost deposits and had to deal with the awkwardness of uninviting guests who'd already made travel arrangements. The most difficult part was explaining to friends and family that the wedding was off because my daughter had catfished my fiancé's best friend to expose his willingness to emotionally cheat. Looking back, I can see that Madison was trying to protect me from someone who might have hurt me later, but her methods were so destructive that they eliminated any possibility of working through David's betrayal in a healthy way. She'd created a situation where Linda couldn't stay with our family regardless of whether she forgave David, because she couldn't trust Madison not to manipulate future relationships. The irony is that Madison got exactly what she wanted. Our family remained just the two of us, and she never had to share me with a stepmother or worry about our family dynamic changing. But the cost was my happiness and Linda's trust. Plus, Madison had to live with knowing she was capable of sophisticated emotional manipulation when motivated by fear and grief. I still wonder sometimes if Linda and I could have worked through David's betrayal if Madison had handled her concerns differently. But I also can't deny that Madison exposed real character flaws that might have caused problems later. The whole situation taught me that grief can manifest in ways that protect and destroy simultaneously, often within the same actions. Children aren't the only family members capable of elaborate deceptions. Sometimes the people who've known you longest hide the biggest lies. My Uncle Rick was always the golden child of our family, the one everyone pointed to as proof that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Growing up, Rick had this mysterious consulting business that seemed to generate impressive income without anyone really understanding what he did all day. He'd show up to family gatherings in expensive suits, driving luxury cars, always picking up the check at restaurants with a casual wave that suggested money was never a concern. While my parents struggled through middle-class financial stress, Rick lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs and took exotic vacations that he'd document extensively on social media. He was generous with family members during tough times, always ready to help with a loan or cover unexpected expenses. When I graduated college, Rick even offered to help me establish credit and navigate the adult world of financial responsibility. I was 24 and fresh out of college when I started noticing problems with my credit applications. Despite having a decent job and no history of financial irresponsibility, I kept getting denied for credit cards and apartment rentals. The rejection letters mentioned issues with my credit history, but I'd never had a credit card or loan before, so I couldn't understand what they were referencing. Initially, I assumed there was some kind of bureaucratic mistake, maybe a mix-up with someone who had a similar name or social security number. I'd heard about identity theft happening to other people, but it always seemed like something that happened to careless people who fell for obvious scams. I certainly never suspected that someone in my own family was systematically destroying my financial future. The first concrete evidence came when I finally decided to pull my actual credit report instead of just wondering why applications kept getting rejected. What I found was horrifying. There were multiple credit cards in my name that I'd never applied for, a car loan for a vehicle I'd never seen, and even a mortgage application that had been submitted using my information. All of the addresses associated with these accounts led back to Uncle Rick's house. The amounts were staggering. Someone had run up over $40,000 in credit card debt using my identity, and the car loan was for another $30,000. There were also several smaller personal loans and store credit accounts that I'd never authorized. My credit score was completely destroyed, and I had no idea how long this had been going on or how extensive the damage really was. Confronting Rick about the fraudulent accounts was one of the most uncomfortable conversations of my life. I'd always looked up to him as the successful family member who'd figured out how to make money work for him. Walking into his house with printouts of credit reports and account statements felt like accusing my role model of being a criminal. Rick's initial reaction was surprise and confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I was bringing these documents to him. He examined the credit reports with the same puzzled expression he might have used for a crossword puzzle, occasionally making comments about how identity theft was becoming such a problem these days. But when I pointed out that all the accounts listed his address, his demeanor shifted to something more defensive. The explanation Rick gave me was elaborate and almost convincing. He claimed that he'd been helping me establish credit by using my information for some of his business accounts, intending to pay everything off before I ever needed to use my credit independently. Rick said he'd planned to explain everything once the accounts were settled, framing his actions as a favor that would give me a head start in the adult world. According to Rick, everything he'd done was part of a complex financial strategy that would benefit our entire family. He was supposedly using multiple family members' credit to leverage business opportunities that would eventually pay off everyone's debt and provide long-term financial security. Rick made it sound like a sophisticated investment scheme rather than identity theft. But that wasn't even the worst part. Rick insisted that confronting him about the accounts was actually counterproductive because it interfered with his ability to manage the debt strategically. He claimed that if I started disputing the accounts or involving credit bureaus, it would disrupt his repayment plans and potentially make everything worse for both of us. Rick's manipulation was subtle but effective. He positioned himself as the financial expert who understood complex strategies that I couldn't possibly grasp with my limited experience. He suggested that my college education had taught me theory, but not practical knowledge about how money really worked in the adult world. Rick made me feel naive for questioning his methods. The guilt trip that followed was masterful in its execution. Rick reminded me of all the times he'd helped our family financially, all the dinners he'd paid for, all the advice he'd given me about career choices and financial planning. He suggested that my accusations were not only hurtful, but ungrateful, given everything he'd done to support me throughout my life. Rick promised to fix everything within 6 months, claiming he just needed time to liquidate some business assets and reorganize his accounts. He showed me what looked like legitimate business documents and financial statements that suggested he had the resources to resolve the debt. Rick insisted that involving outside authorities would just complicate the situation and potentially hurt other family members who were part of his financial strategies. For several weeks, I actually believed Rick's explanations and agreed to give him time to resolve the accounts. He'd been such a consistent presence in my life, and his financial success had always seemed genuine. The idea that he was using my identity for criminal purposes was harder to accept than the possibility that he was just managing money in ways I didn't understand. That's when everything unraveled. Rick was arrested in a completely unrelated fraud investigation involving his supposed consulting business. Turns out, Rick's mysterious income came from running investment scams where he promised clients huge returns on fake business opportunities. When police searched his house and seized his financial records, they discovered he'd been using family members' identities for years. The investigation revealed that Rick's entire successful lifestyle had been funded by identity theft and investment fraud. He'd been using my social security number, along with those of at least 6 other family members, to open credit accounts and secure loans that he never intended to repay. Rick had been systematically destroying our credit while funding his expensive lifestyle and fake business operations. The scope of Rick's fraud was breathtaking in its audacity. He'd opened over 30 fraudulent accounts using family members' identities, accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and had been running this operation for nearly 8 years. Rick had used our credit to buy luxury cars, finance expensive vacations, and maintain the illusion of business success that made him seem trustworthy to his investment scam victims. And here's where it gets absurd. Rick had been so confident in his ability to manipulate family members that he'd kept detailed records of which identities he was using for which accounts. Police found spreadsheets on his computer that tracked our credit scores, available credit limits, and optimal timing for opening new accounts. He'd been treating our identities like business assets. The family reaction to Rick's arrest was split between shock and denial. Some relatives couldn't believe that the successful, generous family member they'd admired for years was actually a criminal who'd been stealing from his own relatives. Others immediately began damage control, worried about how Rick's crimes would reflect on the family's reputation in our community. When I decided to press charges against Rick, the family pressure was intense and emotionally brutal. Several relatives argued that sending Rick to prison wouldn't solve the financial damage and would only hurt our family further. They suggested that Rick's crimes were motivated by desperation rather than malice, and that family members should stick together during difficult times. The most painful arguments came from family members who insisted that blood is thicker than water, and that I should forgive Rick's actions for the sake of family unity. They seemed to believe that Rick's years of identity theft were somehow less serious because he'd targeted relatives rather than strangers. The logic was that family members should be willing to absorb financial damage to protect each other from criminal consequences. My parents were torn between supporting me and maintaining relationships with Rick's immediate family. Rick's wife and children were facing their own financial devastation as their lifestyle crumbled and Rick's assets were seized to pay restitution to his fraud victims. Some family members felt that prosecuting Rick would just create more victims without solving anything. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, revealing more details about Rick's criminal operations and the extent of damage he'd caused to multiple family members. Rick's defense team tried to portray him as someone who'd made poor decisions while trying to provide for his family, rather than a calculating criminal who'd systematically exploited his relatives' trust. Rick eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud, and securities fraud. He received a 7-year prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution to all his victims, including family members. The restitution amounts were far more than Rick could ever realistically pay, given that most of his assets were seized and his earning potential was destroyed. Rebuilding my credit and financial standing took over 3 years and required constant vigilance to dispute fraudulent accounts and establish a legitimate credit history. I had to provide extensive documentation to prove that the accounts Rick had opened were fraudulent, a process that involved multiple credit bureaus, law enforcement agencies, and financial institutions. The emotional toll was harder to quantify, but equally devastating. Rick's betrayal shattered my trust in family relationships and made me hyper-vigilant about financial security in ways that affected my daily life. I became obsessive about monitoring credit reports and financial accounts, paranoid that someone else might be using my identity for criminal purposes. The family relationships that were damaged by Rick's crimes never fully recovered. Several relatives stopped speaking to me after I testified against Rick in court, viewing my cooperation with prosecutors as a betrayal of family loyalty. Holiday gatherings became tense affairs where Rick's crimes were the unspoken topic that colored every conversation. Rick's wife and children faced their own financial ruin and social stigma as the scope of his fraud became public knowledge in our community. His children had to deal with classmates and neighbors knowing their father was a criminal, while his wife struggled to find employment and housing after years of living on the proceeds of criminal activities. The most disturbing revelation was learning how common family identity theft actually is. The detective who worked Rick's case explained that relatives are often the easiest targets for identity theft because they have access to personal information and their victims are less likely to prosecute due to family pressure. Rick's crimes were sophisticated, but the basic pattern was depressingly familiar to law enforcement. Looking back, there were warning signs about Rick's character that I'd either missed or dismissed because I wanted to believe in his success story. His reluctance to discuss his business in detail, his tendency to change the subject when asked about specific clients or projects, his habit of paying for everything in cash rather than using credit cards or checks that would leave paper trails. The consulting business that had supposedly generated Rick's wealth was entirely fictional. He'd created fake business cards, websites, and marketing materials to support the illusion that he was providing legitimate services to corporate clients. Rick's office was just a rented space where he'd meet with investment fraud victims, not a functioning business operation. Recovery from Rick's identity theft required not just financial rehabilitation, but also psychological healing from the betrayal of someone I'd trusted and admired. I had to learn to rebuild relationships with family members who'd initially blamed me for Rick's consequences, while also maintaining boundaries with relatives who continued to minimize his crimes. The experience taught me that financial fraud within families is particularly devastating because it combines material damage with emotional betrayal in ways that affect both immediate security and long-term relationships. Rick's crimes didn't just steal money, they stole trust and family connections that can never be fully restored. Rick served 5 years of his 7-year sentence and was released on parole. He's prohibited from working in any financial services capacity and has to report his activities to probation officers. The restitution payments are minimal because Rick has no significant income or assets, meaning his victims will never recover most of what he stole. Family secrets can reshape everything you thought you knew about your life. But nothing could have prepared me for what this grandmother's will revealed. My grandmother Elena was the cornerstone of our family, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, kept photo albums organized by decade, and always had homemade cookies waiting when you visited. She raised 4 children as a single mother after my grandfather died young, and she was the person everyone turned to for advice, comfort, or just a listening ear. When she passed away at 87 after a brief illness, it felt like losing the family historian and emotional anchor all at once. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, and my mother seemed unusually anxious about the whole process. Mom kept making comments about how Grandma might have left some surprising instructions, or how elderly people sometimes get confused about important matters in their final years. I assumed she was worried about family heirlooms being distributed fairly among the siblings, or maybe concerned about potential drama over Grandma's modest savings account. Grandma had always been very organized about her affairs, keeping important documents in a filing cabinet that she'd shown me several times over the years. She'd mentioned that there were some letters she'd written to be opened after her death, personal messages for family members that she wanted to share when she couldn't deliver them herself. I thought it was sweet that she'd taken time to write final thoughts for each of us. The lawyer's office felt somber as our family gathered around the conference table. My mother, my 2 aunts, my uncle, and I sat listening as Grandma's attorney read through the standard provisions of her will. The house would go to my mother, the savings would be divided among the siblings, and various personal items were designated for specific family members. Everything seemed straightforward until the lawyer mentioned a sealed envelope addressed specifically to me. The envelope was thick, containing what felt like several pages of handwritten material. Grandma had written my name on the outside in her distinctive cursive, along with instructions that it should only be opened after her death and only in the presence of my mother. The lawyer explained that Grandma had been very specific about these conditions when she'd updated her will 6 months earlier. My mother's face went completely pale when the lawyer handed me the envelope. She kept glancing at the exit like she was considering leaving the room, but she stayed seated with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The rest of the family seemed curious about what special message Grandma might have left for her only grandchild, but there was tension in the air that I couldn't quite identify. Opening that envelope changed everything I thought I knew about my life and my family. The first page was a letter from Grandma, written in the shaky handwriting of someone fighting through illness, but determined to tell the truth. She started by saying how much she loved me, how proud she was of the person I'd become, and how sorry she was for keeping a terrible secret for 23 years. The words that followed felt like reading someone else's nightmare. Grandma's letter explained that I wasn't actually her biological grandchild, that my mother had kidnapped me from a park when I was 2 years old, and that she'd helped cover up the crime by creating false documents and moving our family to a different state. The woman I'd called mother my entire life had stolen me from my real parents, who'd been searching for me ever since. But that wasn't even the worst part. Grandma's letter included detailed information about my real family, including my original name, my biological parents' names and last known address, and even photocopies of old newspaper clippings about a missing child case that had never been solved. She'd kept documentation of the crime for over 2 decades, apparently planning to reveal the truth eventually, but never finding the courage until she was dying. According to Grandma's letter, my real name was Christopher James Martinez, and I'd been playing at a park in Phoenix while my mother was distracted by a phone call. My kidnapper, the woman I'd called Mom my entire life, was named Patricia Williams, and she'd been struggling with infertility for years before she made the desperate decision to take someone else's child. Grandma had helped Patricia create a new identity for both of us, and we'd moved to Oregon where no one would question our story. The newspaper clippings Grandma had saved were heartbreaking to read. They described frantic parents searching for their missing toddler, police investigations that had gone nowhere, and a family destroyed by the disappearance of their child. There were photos of my biological parents holding pictures of me as a 2-year-old, pleading for information about their missing son. The resemblance between the child in those photos and my own baby pictures was unmistakable. Grandma's letter went into painful detail about how the kidnapping had affected everyone involved. She described watching Patricia struggle with guilt and paranoia for years, always worried that someone would recognize me or that the truth would somehow be discovered. Grandma had convinced herself that she was protecting a desperate woman who'd made a terrible mistake, but she'd carried the weight of the secret for decades. The most devastating part of Grandma's confession was learning that my biological parents had never stopped looking for me. She'd kept track of their efforts through private investigators and online searches, watching them age and grieve while raising the child they'd stolen from them. Grandma had seen my real parents on news programs, appealing for information about their missing son, and she'd kept silent while they suffered. And here's where it gets absurd. My mother Patricia was sitting right there in the lawyer's office, listening to me read the detailed confession of her crime, and her first reaction was to get angry at Grandma for betraying her trust. She actually said that Grandma had promised to take the secret to her grave, and that revealing the truth after death was a cruel betrayal of their agreement. The room went completely silent as everyone processed what they'd just heard. My aunts and uncle were staring at Patricia like they'd never seen her before, which in a sense they hadn't. The woman they'd known as their sister-in-law for over 20 years was actually a kidnapper who'd stolen a child and built her entire adult life around that crime. The family dynamics I'd grown up with were all based on a lie. Patricia's breakdown was immediate and complete. She started sobbing and confessing details that went beyond what Grandma had written in her letter. She talked about watching me at the park for several days before taking me, planning the kidnapping because she'd convinced herself that my biological parents were neglectful for leaving me unattended. Patricia had rationalized her actions by telling herself she was rescuing me from parents who didn't deserve to have a child. The psychological justifications Patricia had created for her crime were disturbing in their complexity. She'd convinced herself that she was saving me from a life of neglect or abuse, despite having no evidence that my biological parents were anything other than loving and responsible. Patricia had created an entire narrative where she was the hero rescuing a child from a bad situation, rather than a criminal destroying a family. Patricia's confession revealed that she'd been living in constant fear of discovery for over 2 decades. Every time I had to provide identification for school enrollment or medical care, every time someone commented on my appearance or asked about family resemblance, every time there was news coverage of missing children cases, Patricia would panic that our secret was about to be exposed. The legal implications of Grandma's revelation were immediate and terrifying. Patricia had committed multiple felonies, including kidnapping, child abduction, identity fraud, and creating false documents. The statute of limitations hadn't expired on most of these crimes, and the evidence Grandma had preserved would be more than sufficient for prosecution. Patricia was facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. What happened next felt like navigating a nightmare, where every choice led to more pain for someone I loved. I had to decide whether to contact my biological parents, who'd been grieving the loss of their child for 23 years. I had to figure out whether to cooperate with law enforcement in prosecuting the woman who'd raised me. I had to process the fact that my entire identity was built on a crime. The decision to reach out to my biological parents was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Through the private investigators' information Grandma had provided, I was able to contact David and Maria Martinez, who were now in their 50s and had never had another child after losing me. The phone call where I explained who I was and how I'd discovered the truth about my disappearance was emotionally devastating for all of us. Meeting my biological parents for the first time in 21 years was surreal and heartbreaking. They'd kept my childhood bedroom exactly as it was when I disappeared, hoping someday I'd come home. They had photo albums documenting the life I should have had, family events I'd missed, relatives I'd never met. David and Maria had built their entire adult lives around the hope of finding their missing son. The reunion with my biological family was complicated by the fact that I had no memory of them all my life before age 2. While DNA testing confirmed that I was definitely their missing child, I was essentially a stranger who happened to share their genetics. They were desperate to reconnect with the child they'd lost, but I was an adult who'd been raised by the person who'd kidnapped me. Things went from bad to unhinged when law enforcement got involved. The FBI reopened the cold case based on Grandma's evidence, and Patricia was arrested on federal kidnapping charges. The media attention was intense, with news outlets covering the story of a child who'd been reunited with his biological family after more than 2 decades. Our private family crisis became public entertainment. Patricia's arrest meant I had to testify about her confession and provide evidence from Grandma's letter. The legal system required me to cooperate in prosecuting the woman who'd raised me, loved me, and been the only mother I'd ever known. The moral complexity of sending my kidnapper to prison while feeling grateful for the life she'd given me was almost impossible to navigate. The trial was a media circus that exposed every painful detail of our family's story. Patricia's defense team tried to portray her as a mentally ill woman who'd made a desperate mistake, while prosecutors painted her as a calculating criminal who destroyed multiple lives for her own selfish desires. I was caught in the middle, trying to balance justice for my biological parents with loyalty to the woman who'd raised me. Patricia was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. The judge acknowledged that she'd been a loving mother to me, but emphasized that kidnapping is one of the most serious crimes possible and that my biological parents had suffered tremendously because of her actions. Patricia would likely spend her remaining healthy years in prison. The aftermath of the trial left everyone in our extended family struggling to process what had happened. My aunts and uncle had to reconcile their relationship with a woman they'd known for decades with the fact that she was a convicted felon who'd built her entire adult life on a lie. Some family members felt betrayed by Patricia's deception, while others sympathized with her desperation and mental health struggles. My relationship with my biological parents has been slowly developing over the past year, but it's complicated by the fact that we're essentially strangers trying to build a connection based on genetics and shared trauma. David and Maria are wonderful people who've been incredibly patient with my need to process everything gradually, but we can't recreate the parent-child bond that was stolen when I was 2 years old. The most difficult part of this entire situation is that I love both families, despite the criminal circumstances that created this impossible situation. Patricia may be a kidnapper, but she was also a devoted mother who gave me a stable, loving childhood. My biological parents are the family I was stolen from, but they're also people I'm just getting to know as an adult. I visit Patricia in prison occasionally, and these conversations are emotionally exhausting for both of us. She expresses remorse for the pain she caused my biological parents, but she also says she can't completely regret taking me because she loved raising me and believes she was a good mother. Patricia struggles with accepting that her love for me doesn't justify the crime she committed to get me. The legal resolution of the case doesn't address the emotional complexity of loving someone who committed a terrible crime against people you also love. My biological parents have been gracious about my relationship with Patricia, understanding that she was the only mother I knew for most of my life. They're focused on building a relationship with me now, rather than dwelling on the years they lost. Looking back, there were probably signs that something wasn't quite right about my family history, but they were subtle enough that I never questioned them seriously. Patricia had always been vague about our family background, claiming that most relatives had died when I was young or lived far away. She'd been reluctant to discuss my early childhood, saying she didn't want to dwell on sad memories. The experience has taught me that family bonds can survive almost anything, but they can also be built on foundations that aren't what they seem. The love I received from Patricia was real, even though it was based on a crime. The connection I'm developing with my biological parents is meaningful, even though it's happening decades later than it should have. Healing from this situation requires accepting that both things can be true simultaneously. Sometimes workplace drama can feel like family conflict, especially when trusted colleagues cross every professional boundary. Working at Meridian Marketing for 3 years had been the best job of my career until Derek Walsh became my direct supervisor 6 months ago. Derek was one of those middle management types who seemed more concerned with asserting authority than actually managing people effectively. He was married with 2 kids, always talking about family vacations and little league games, projecting this image of being a devoted family man while micromanaging everyone who reported to him. Things started getting weird around the time Jennifer Chen joined as our new HR director. Jennifer was competent and professional, but there was something about the way Derek's behavior changed after she arrived that made me uncomfortable. He'd always been demanding, but suddenly he was finding fault with work that had never been an issue before. My performance reviews had been consistently excellent, but Derek started writing me up for minor infractions that seemed blown out of proportion. The first warning came when Derek claimed I'd missed a deadline that I was certain I'd met. When I showed him the email confirmation proving I'd submitted the work on time, he said the quality wasn't up to standards and wrote me up anyway. The second warning was for supposedly being late to meetings, even though I'd been punctual for 3 years. Derek started documenting every minor interaction we had, creating a paper trail that made it look like I was a problem employee. What made Derek's behavior even more suspicious was how he'd always find excuses to walk past Jennifer's office or schedule unnecessary meetings that required her input. He'd CC her on emails that didn't really need HR involvement, and he'd bring up her opinions during team discussions in ways that seemed designed to impress her rather than serve any business purpose. The whole dynamic felt unprofessional and made me wonder what was really going on between them. Jennifer's support for Derek's increasingly harsh treatment of me was what really convinced me something inappropriate was happening. Every time I tried to discuss Derek's behavior with HR, Jennifer would defend his actions and suggest that maybe I needed to be more receptive to feedback. She'd frame Derek's nitpicking as constructive management, even when his criticisms were clearly unreasonable or factually incorrect. The performance improvement plan Derek put me on was obviously designed to justify firing me, rather than actually helping me improve. The goals were vague and subjective, the timeline was unrealistic, and the success metrics kept changing whenever I managed to meet his expectations. Derek was building a case for termination, while Jennifer provided HR cover for his actions, creating this perfect storm of workplace harassment disguised as legitimate performance management. But that wasn't even the worst part. Derek started scheduling our performance review meetings for times when Jennifer could attend as a witness, supposedly to ensure fairness and documentation. These meetings felt more like interrogations, with Derek making accusations about my work quality, while Jennifer took notes and nodded along. The two of them had clearly coordinated their approach to make my termination seem justified and legally defensible. I knew I was being set up for wrongful termination, but I couldn't prove that Derek's behavior was motivated by anything other than legitimate performance concerns. His documentation was thorough, and Jennifer's backing gave his claims credibility with upper management. I felt trapped in a situation where my job was being systematically destroyed by people who were supposed to be professional and fair. The evidence I needed came from staying late at the office one Thursday evening to catch up on work, hoping to exceed Derek's unrealistic expectations and somehow save my job. I was the only person left on our floor, or at least I thought I was, when I heard voices coming from the conference room. Derek and Jennifer were having what sounded like a heated personal conversation, not a business discussion. Walking past the conference room to investigate, I saw Derek and Jennifer in a compromising position that left no doubt about their relationship. They were kissing passionately, with Derek's hands in places that were definitely not appropriate for a professional interaction. Jennifer had her arms around Derek's neck, and they were clearly having an intimate moment that had nothing to do with work or HR policies. My first instinct was to back away quietly and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but then I realized this explained everything about Derek's recent behavior toward me. He'd been creating a hostile work environment to impress his new girlfriend, using his authority to punish employees while Jennifer provided HR protection for his actions. Their affair was the reason I was being systematically harassed and set up for termination. I used my phone to document what I was seeing, taking photos and a short video of Derek and Jennifer's obviously romantic encounter. This wasn't workplace harassment or assault, this was two consenting adults having an affair. But it was happening in our office, and it directly explained the professional retaliation I'd been experiencing. Derek was abusing his power to create a toxic environment, while Jennifer enabled his behavior through her HR position. And here's where it gets absurd. After documenting their affair, I decided to do some investigating into Derek's recent performance reviews and HR complaints. Using my access to shared folders and email systems, I discovered that Derek had been systematically targeting other employees who might pose a threat to his relationship with Jennifer, or who had legitimate complaints about workplace issues. Derek's pattern of retaliation extended beyond just me. He'd written up 3 other employees for questionable infractions since Jennifer's arrival, and all of these employees had either questioned Derek's judgment or expressed concerns about workplace policies that Jennifer was responsible for implementing. Derek was using his management position to eliminate anyone who might threaten his personal relationship. The email communications between Derek and Jennifer revealed that their affair had been going on for almost the entire time she'd been with the company. They'd been coordinating their actions to protect each other's positions while punishing employees who might expose their inappropriate relationship. Jennifer was violating every ethical standard of human resources management by participating in this scheme. Then came the breaking point. Derek scheduled my termination meeting for the following Monday, claiming that my performance hadn't improved sufficiently during the probationary period. He'd arranged for Jennifer to attend as an HR witness, and he'd already drafted the termination paperwork, citing performance issues that were clearly fabricated or exaggerated. I was about to be fired for reasons that had nothing to do with my actual work performance. The termination meeting felt like a kangaroo court, with Derek reading from a prepared script while Jennifer nodded and took notes. They'd coordinated their presentation to make my firing seem inevitable and justified, citing incidents that were either minor or completely misrepresented. Derek was clearly enjoying the power dynamic, while Jennifer was providing the HR credibility that made the whole charade seem legitimate. That's when I decided to reveal what I knew about their affair and how it related to my treatment as an employee. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos and video I'd taken of their romantic encounter in the conference room. The look of panic on both their faces was immediate and satisfying, especially Derek's expression when he realized his abuse of power had been documented. The evidence I presented wasn't just about their personal relationship. It was about how they'd been using their professional positions to retaliate against employees who threatened their affair. I had emails, performance reviews, and documented interactions that showed Derek's pattern of harassment while Jennifer provided cover through her HR authority. Their personal relationship had corrupted their professional judgment in ways that violated company policy and potentially labor laws. Derek immediately tried to claim that his personal relationship with Jennifer had nothing to do with my performance issues, but the timeline and evidence made it clear that his behavior toward me had changed dramatically after their affair began. Jennifer tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but she couldn't explain why she'd supported Derek's increasingly unreasonable treatment of multiple employees. What happened next was the most satisfying reversal I've ever experienced in a professional setting. Instead of being fired, I found myself in the position of having leverage over 2 people who'd been systematically abusing their authority. Derek and Jennifer's affair wasn't just a personal matter. It was a clear violation of company policies about supervisor relationships and conflicts of interest. The company's response was swift and decisive once the evidence was presented to upper management. Derek was fired immediately for creating a hostile work environment and abusing his supervisory authority. Jennifer was transferred to a different division with a formal reprimand in her personnel file. The company also offered me a settlement package that included back pay, a promotion, and assurance that my performance record would be corrected. The investigation that followed my revelations uncovered additional evidence of Derek and Jennifer's coordinated retaliation against other employees. 3 other workers came forward with similar stories about Derek's sudden change in behavior and Jennifer's suspicious support for his actions. The company ended up settling multiple wrongful termination and harassment claims related to their affair. The policy changes that resulted from this situation were comprehensive and necessary. The company implemented new rules about romantic relationships between supervisors and HR personnel, created independent channels for reporting management abuse, and established better oversight of performance improvement plans to prevent them from being used as retaliation tools. Derek's termination became a cautionary tale about how personal relationships can corrupt professional judgment and create liability for employers. His wife found out about the affair through the company's investigation, and their marriage ended in a very public and expensive divorce. Derek's reputation in our industry was permanently damaged, and he struggled to find comparable employment after word spread about his behavior. Jennifer's career suffered significant damage despite avoiding termination. Her transfer was seen as a demotion by everyone in the company, and her involvement in Derek's retaliation scheme made other employees question her integrity and professional judgment. She eventually left the company voluntarily, presumably because her position had become untenable. The most satisfying part of this entire experience was watching Derek's carefully constructed facade of being a devoted family man and ethical manager crumble under the weight of his own actions. His affair with Jennifer wasn't just personal betrayal, it was professional misconduct that demonstrated his willingness to abuse power for personal gain. My relationship with my colleagues improved dramatically after Derek's departure, and the truth about his behavior became known. Other employees who'd been targeted by Derek felt vindicated, and the toxic atmosphere he'd created dissipated almost immediately. The new management structure that replaced Derek was focused on actual performance and professional development, rather than personal vendettas. Looking back, I'm proud that I stood up for myself and exposed Derek and Jennifer's corruption, rather than just accepting wrongful termination. Their affair might have been their personal business, but using their professional positions to retaliate against employees who threatened their relationship was inexcusable and illegal. Justice doesn't always happen in the workplace, but sometimes the bad guys really do get what they deserve. The experience taught me to document everything when dealing with potentially hostile management and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong about workplace dynamics. Derek's behavior toward me wasn't just bad management, it was targeted harassment motivated by his personal relationship with Jennifer. Recognizing that pattern and gathering evidence saved my career and exposed their corruption. Professional betrayals sting, but they're nothing compared to discovering someone has built their entire career on lies. Michelle Rodriguez joined our consulting firm 2 years ago and immediately made sure everyone knew about her Harvard MBA. She'd work it into conversations constantly, mentioning specific professors, talking about case studies from her classes, and name-dropping classmates who were supposedly working at prestigious companies around the world. Michelle had this way of making her Harvard credentials feel like the most important qualification in any room, and honestly, it was intimidating enough that most people just accepted her expertise without question. The thing about Michelle was how she used her supposed Harvard education as a weapon in workplace discussions. Whenever someone disagreed with her ideas or questioned her judgment, she'd make subtle references to the analytical frameworks she'd learned at Harvard or the strategic thinking that her MBA had taught her. It was intellectual bullying disguised as professional credibility, and it worked surprisingly well on our management team. Michelle's rise through the company was meteoric and largely based on her educational pedigree. She'd been hired as a senior consultant but quickly positioned herself for promotion by emphasizing how her Harvard training made her uniquely qualified for leadership roles. During meetings with clients, she'd casually mention her MBA when presenting recommendations, lending weight to her proposals in ways that were hard to challenge. I'd been with the company for 4 years, and had worked my way up through solid performance and client relationships, but I was consistently passed over for promotions that went to Michelle instead. The feedback I received was always that Michelle brought a level of strategic thinking and analytical rigor that came from her elite educational background. It felt like my state school business degree and practical experience couldn't compete with the Harvard mystique. The inconsistencies in Michelle's stories started becoming apparent about 8 months after she joined the company. She'd mention different professors teaching the same classes or reference Harvard programs that didn't quite match up with what I could find online. Michelle would talk about specific campus locations or traditions that seemed off when I looked them up, but the details were subtle enough that I initially dismissed them as memory lapses or misunderstandings. What really caught my attention was when Michelle mentioned a particular case study that she claimed to have worked on in her Harvard strategy class. I happened to know that case study from my own graduate coursework, and the details she described were completely wrong. Not just different interpretations or alternative approaches, but fundamental facts about the companies and scenarios involved. It was like she'd heard about the case secondhand and filled in the gaps with guesswork. But that wasn't even the worst part. Michelle started getting promoted ahead of colleagues who had more experience, stronger client relationships, and better performance reviews. Her Harvard MBA had become this golden ticket that trumped every other qualification or achievement. Management seemed convinced that Michelle's elite education made her inherently more capable than the rest of us, despite evidence that her actual work product was mediocre at best. I decided to do some subtle investigation into Michelle's background, partly out of professional curiosity and partly because her promotion trajectory was affecting my own career prospects. I started by looking up Harvard Business School class directories and alumni networks, searching for any trace of Michelle Rodriguez among recent graduates. What I found was concerning. There was no record of Michelle attending Harvard Business School during the years she claimed to have been there. The deeper I dug into Michelle's educational background, the more suspicious things became. I couldn't find her name in any Harvard publications, alumni directories, or academic records that should have been publicly available. When I searched for her on professional networks, where Harvard MBA graduates typically maintain profiles, Michelle was notably absent from groups and discussions where she should have been active if her credentials were legitimate. Using public records and social media archaeology, I eventually discovered that Michelle had actually attended Riverside Community College for 2 years and then transferred to a mid-tier state university where she'd earned a bachelor's degree in business administration. There was no graduate school in her academic history, let alone an MBA from Harvard. Michelle had fabricated her entire educational pedigree and had been using it to advance her career for years. The revelation that Michelle's Harvard MBA was completely fake explained so much about her behavior and the inconsistencies I'd noticed in her stories. She'd been improvising details about professors, programs, and experiences that she'd never actually had, which explained why her references never quite matched up with reality. Michelle had built her professional reputation on a lie that was sophisticated enough to fool our HR department and management team. Around this time, Michelle was promoted to Director of Strategic Planning, a position that gave her significant influence over resource allocation and departmental priorities. The promotion was justified largely based on her Harvard credentials and the strategic perspective that her MBA supposedly provided. Michelle was now in a position to make decisions that directly affected my work and the future of our department. Michelle's first major initiative as director was restructuring our client service model based on what she claimed were best practices from Harvard case studies. The changes she proposed would have eliminated several positions in my department while expanding Michelle's own team and budget. She presented her recommendations as data-driven strategic analysis, backed by rigorous academic research, but I recognized her proposals as poorly thought-out ideas dressed up with business school jargon. Then came the breaking point. Michelle scheduled a presentation to the executive team to unveil her strategic restructuring plan and demonstrate the analytical frameworks that would guide our company's future direction. This was her moment to prove that her Harvard education translated into real business value, and the entire senior leadership team would be in attendance to evaluate her recommendations. I realized this presentation would be the perfect opportunity to expose Michelle's fraudulent credentials in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. If she really had an MBA from Harvard, she should be able to answer detailed questions about the professors, programs, and methodologies she claimed to have learned. If she was lying about her education, those questions would expose her ignorance in front of the people who'd promoted her based on those credentials. The day of Michelle's presentation, I prepared a series of specific questions about Harvard Business School that any genuine graduate should be able to answer easily. I researched current faculty names, popular course offerings, notable alumni, and distinctive aspects of the Harvard MBA program that Michelle should know intimately if she'd actually attended the school. Michelle's presentation started confidently, with her using business terminology and analytical frameworks that sounded impressive to people who weren't familiar with MBA-level strategic thinking. She talked about Porter's 5 forces, SWOT analysis, and competitive positioning in ways that demonstrated she'd read business books but revealed a superficial understanding of how these concepts actually worked in practice. And here's where it gets absurd. When Michelle opened the floor for questions, I started asking her about specific details of her Harvard experience that should have been easy to answer if she'd actually attended the school. I asked about Professor Clayton Christensen's Innovation Theory course, about the case study method used in strategy classes, about the differences between first and second year curriculum requirements. Michelle's responses were immediate red flags to anyone who knew anything about Harvard Business School. She couldn't name any specific professors beyond ones who were famous enough to be widely known. She described teaching methods and campus experiences that didn't match Harvard's actual programs. Most tellingly, she couldn't answer basic questions about the school's culture, traditions, or distinctive characteristics that any graduate would remember. The panic in Michelle's eyes was visible to everyone in the room as she realized her lies were being exposed in real time. She tried to deflect my questions by saying that her Harvard experience was personal and that she preferred to focus on current business challenges rather than academic memories. But the damage was already done, and several executives were clearly skeptical about her responses. What happened next was a masterclass in watching someone's carefully constructed facade crumble under scrutiny. Michelle attempted to redirect the conversation back to her strategic recommendations, but the executives were now asking follow-up questions about her educational background and how it related to her business proposals. Her credibility was evaporating as people realized her Harvard credentials might not be legitimate. The executive team asked Michelle to provide documentation of her Harvard MBA after the presentation, which sent her into a panic that was obvious to everyone present. She claimed that her transcripts were stored off-site and that she'd need time to retrieve them, buying herself a few days to figure out how to handle the situation. But it was clear that Michelle's lies were about to be fully exposed. The HR investigation that followed was thorough and damning. Michelle couldn't produce any legitimate documentation of her Harvard attendance because she'd never been there. When HR contacted Harvard Business School directly, they confirmed that no Michelle Rodriguez had graduated from their MBA program during the years she claimed to have attended. The investigation also revealed other lies on her resume, including fabricated work experience and fictional job titles. Michelle was fired within a week of the presentation, and the company had to issue internal communications explaining that her credentials had been falsified and that her strategic recommendations were being reconsidered by qualified analysts. The embarrassment for our management team was significant, as they'd promoted Michelle and implemented her ideas based on fraudulent qualifications. The ripple effects of Michelle's deception extended beyond just her termination. The company had to review all hiring practices and implement degree verification policies to prevent similar fraud in the future. Several of Michelle's strategic initiatives had to be abandoned or completely redesigned by people with legitimate qualifications. Clients who'd been impressed by her Harvard credentials felt misled and questioned our company's due diligence. My own career benefited significantly from exposing Michelle's fraud. The director position she'd held was offered to me, along with a substantial salary increase and recognition for my integrity in revealing the deception. The executive team acknowledged that they should have been promoting based on actual performance and results, rather than perceived educational prestige. The legal consequences for Michelle were surprisingly severe. The company sued her for fraud and misrepresentation, seeking damages for the costs associated with implementing her flawed strategies and the reputational damage caused by her deception. Michelle also faced potential criminal charges for using false credentials to obtain employment, though I'm not sure how those proceedings ended. The psychological profile of someone who maintains such an elaborate lie for years is fascinating and disturbing. Michelle had to constantly improvise details about an educational experience she'd never had, remember which stories she'd told to which people, and somehow convince herself that her deception was justified by her actual capabilities. The mental energy required to sustain that level of fraud must have been exhausting. Looking back, there were warning signs about Michelle's character that went beyond just her educational lies. She was willing to take credit for other people's work, quick to blame colleagues when projects went poorly, and generally demonstrated the kind of ethical flexibility that made fabricating credentials seem acceptable to her. The Harvard lie was just the most obvious example of her willingness to deceive for personal advancement. The experience taught me valuable lessons about workplace dynamics and the importance of verifying credentials, especially when they seemed too impressive to be true. Michelle's Harvard MBA had been the foundation of her professional identity and career advancement, but it was also the weakness that ultimately destroyed her when subjected to scrutiny by someone who knew what questions to ask. The company's response to Michelle's fraud was comprehensive and necessary, but it also highlighted how easily our hiring and promotion processes could be gamed by someone willing to lie convincingly. Educational credentials are important, but they shouldn't be the only factor in evaluating someone's qualifications or potential for leadership roles. False credentials are bad enough, but when employees weaponize the legal system itself, that's when things get truly dangerous. Managing the downtown location of Harper Electronics had been the highlight of my retail career for 3 years until Jessica Williams joined my team as a sales associate. Jessica was 26, personable with customers, and seemed eager to learn the business when I hired her. She had previous retail experience and good references, so I was optimistic about her fitting into our small team of 8 employees who'd been working together smoothly for years. The first few months with Jessica went well enough. She was punctual, handled customer interactions professionally, and seemed to get along with the other staff members. I made sure to provide clear feedback during her probationary period, pointing out areas where she could improve her product knowledge and sales techniques. Jessica seemed receptive to coaching, and I thought she had potential to become a solid long-term employee. The problem started around month 4, when Jessica began making small complaints about workplace conditions that seemed disproportionate to the actual issues. She'd mentioned feeling like certain employees got preferential treatment with scheduling, or that I was more patient with some staff members than others. Initially, I took her concerns seriously and tried to address them by being more conscious of how I distributed assignments and managed team dynamics. Jessica's complaints gradually escalated from minor workplace grievances to more serious allegations about my management style. She started claiming that I made inappropriate comments about her appearance, that I assigned her less desirable shifts as punishment for speaking up about problems, and that I created a hostile work environment for female employees. These accusations were completely false, but Jessica presented them with enough specific details to make them seem credible. The turning point came when Jessica requested a meeting with me and the district manager to discuss what she called a pattern of harassment and discrimination. She had prepared a written complaint that outlined months of alleged misconduct, including specific dates and times when I'd supposedly made inappropriate remarks or taken retaliatory actions against her. The allegations were detailed and damaging, painting me as an abusive manager who targeted female employees. What made Jessica's accusations particularly dangerous was how she'd apparently recruited other employees to support her claims. 3 of my staff members provided written statements describing incidents they'd supposedly witnessed, corroborating Jessica's allegations about my behavior and management practices. These were people I'd worked with for years, and their willingness to testify against me was devastating both professionally and personally. But that wasn't even the worst part. Jessica had hired a lawyer who specialized in workplace harassment cases, and they filed a formal lawsuit against both me personally and the company. The lawsuit included claims of sexual harassment, gender discrimination, retaliation, and creating a hostile work environment. The damages they were seeking included lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages that could have bankrupted me personally. The legal documents Jessica's lawyer served were comprehensive and terrifying. They included detailed descriptions of alleged incidents, witness statements from co-workers, and a timeline of supposed harassment that stretched back almost to Jessica's first week of employment. The lawsuit painted me as a predatory manager who systematically abused my authority to harass female employees while the company turned a blind eye to my behavior. My initial response was complete panic and confusion. The incidents Jessica described had never happened, but her accusations were so specific and well documented that they seemed credible to anyone who didn't know the truth. Jessica claimed I'd made inappropriate comments about her body, touched her inappropriately during training sessions, and retaliated against her for rejecting my advances by giving her poor performance reviews and undesirable shifts. The company's response was to immediately suspend me pending investigation and distance themselves from the allegations. Corporate lawyers advised me to hire my own attorney because the lawsuit named me personally, meaning my house, savings, and future earnings were at risk. The district manager who'd known me for years suddenly treated me like a liability rather than a valued employee. The witness statements supporting Jessica's claims were what really made the lawsuit seem legitimate. Co-workers I'd considered friends had signed affidavits describing incidents where I'd supposedly made sexist remarks, shown favoritism to male employees, or created uncomfortable situations for women on our team. Reading their statements felt like discovering that people I trusted had been lying to my face for months. Jessica's lawyer was aggressive and confident, clearly believing they had a strong case based on the evidence they'd compiled. During depositions, they presented a narrative where I was a textbook example of a manager who abused his position to harass female employees. The lawyer had obviously coached Jessica well, because her testimony was detailed, consistent, and delivered with the right mix of emotion and credibility. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, during which my reputation in the company and retail industry was essentially destroyed. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly, and I found myself ostracized by colleagues who'd known me for years, but now viewed me as a potential predator. The stress of fighting false accusations while facing financial ruin was affecting my health, my marriage, and my ability to function normally. And here's where it gets absurd. Just when things seemed hopeless, and I was considering settling the lawsuit to avoid bankruptcy, my lawyer had a breakthrough that changed everything. He'd been reviewing all the evidence and realized that our store had installed a comprehensive security camera system about 6 months before Jessica's alleged harassment began. Every area of the store, including the break room and storage areas, was under constant video surveillance. The security footage that saved my career was sitting in digital storage the entire time, waiting to be reviewed. My lawyer requested all video from the dates and times Jessica claimed the harassment had occurred, and what we found completely contradicted every allegation in her lawsuit. The cameras showed that the incidents Jessica described in vivid detail had simply never happened. The video evidence was devastating to Jessica's case. On dates when she claimed I'd made inappropriate comments in the break room, the footage showed either that we weren't both in the room at the same time, or that our interactions were brief and professional. When Jessica claimed I'd touched her inappropriately during a training session, the video showed me maintaining appropriate distance and conducting myself professionally throughout the entire interaction. Most damning was footage that showed Jessica having private conversations with the co-workers who provided witness statements supporting her claims. The videos revealed Jessica coaching these employees on what to say, offering them money in exchange for their testimony, and rehearsing the details of incidents that had never actually occurred. Jessica had orchestrated an elaborate fraud scheme designed to destroy my career and extract money from the company. That's when everything unraveled. When confronted with video evidence that contradicted their entire case, Jessica's lawyer immediately withdrew from the lawsuit and advised her to seek separate counsel. The witness statements that had seemed so credible were revealed to be fabricated testimony, purchased with cash payments Jessica had made to financially struggling co-workers. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Jessica. The lawsuit was not only dismissed, but she faced criminal charges for perjury, fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The district attorney was particularly interested in prosecuting the case because workplace harassment lawsuits rely on victim credibility, and Jessica's actions damaged the legitimate claims of real harassment victims. The investigation into Jessica's fraud revealed the full scope of her scheme. She'd specifically targeted co-workers who were struggling financially, offering them cash payments of $500 to $1,500 in exchange for signing false witness statements. Jessica had convinced 3 employees to participate by telling them the money was coming from a settlement fund and that they were just confirming details about workplace conditions. What happened next was a complete vindication that felt almost too good to be true. The company not only reinstated me with full back pay, but they promoted me to regional manager and publicly acknowledged that the allegations against me had been fabricated. The co-workers who'd been duped into providing false testimony faced disciplinary action but kept their jobs after cooperating with the investigation. Jessica's criminal trial was a public spectacle that attracted local media attention because of the elaborate nature of her fraud scheme. The prosecutor presented video evidence showing Jessica recruiting false witnesses, coaching their testimony, and making cash payments for their cooperation. Jessica's defense team tried to argue that she genuinely believed she was being harassed, but the video evidence made it clear that she'd knowingly fabricated every allegation. The judge sentenced Jessica to 18 months in prison and ordered her to pay restitution to cover my legal fees and the company's investigation costs. Jessica also faced civil liability for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, though she obviously didn't have the resources to pay significant damages. Her conviction became a cautionary tale about the consequences of filing false harassment claims. The psychological toll of being falsely accused of sexual harassment was something I hadn't anticipated when I first took a management position. Even after being completely vindicated, I struggled with paranoia about how my interactions with female employees might be perceived or misconstrued. The experience taught me to be hyper-vigilant about documentation and witnesses for any employee conversations that could potentially be misrepresented. The security camera system that saved my career became a model for other retail locations in our chain. Corporate leadership realized that comprehensive video surveillance not only protected against theft and liability claims, but also provided crucial evidence in employment disputes. The cameras that I'd initially seen as an unnecessary expense turned out to be the technology that saved my reputation and career. The ripple effects of Jessica's false accusations extended beyond just the immediate legal consequences. Several legitimate workplace harassment cases in our area were viewed with increased skepticism because of the publicity surrounding Jessica's fraud. Her actions made it harder for real victims of workplace abuse to be believed and taken seriously, which was perhaps the most damaging aspect of her scheme. Looking back, there were warning signs about Jessica's character that I missed or dismissed during her employment. She was quick to blame others when things went wrong, often exaggerated minor problems into major grievances, and seemed to test boundaries with both co-workers and management. Her pattern of manufactured complaints should have alerted me to her willingness to fabricate more serious allegations. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach employee relations and conflict resolution. I now document every significant interaction with staff members, ensure that witnesses are present for any disciplinary conversations, and maintain detailed records of performance issues and employee complaints. The paranoia is probably excessive, but Jessica's fraud scheme demonstrated how easily a manager's career can be destroyed by false allegations. The co-workers who participated in Jessica's scheme faced different consequences based on their level of involvement and cooperation with the investigation. The employee who helped Jessica recruit other false witnesses was terminated, while those who simply signed statements they thought were legitimate received formal reprimands and mandatory ethics training. The company handled the situation with surprising nuance given the severity of the fraud. The most satisfying aspect of Jessica's downfall was watching her elaborate scheme collapse under scrutiny. She'd clearly spent months planning her fraud, researching harassment law, and cultivating relationships with vulnerable co-workers she could manipulate. But Jessica had overlooked the one factor that would expose her lies. The security cameras that recorded everything she claimed had happened in private. When workplace hierarchies get twisted by personal relationships, the fallout can destroy multiple lives at once.